High above the frozen skies of Germany, the air was alive with fire. Tracer rounds ripped through the clouds as a formation of American B-17s thundered toward their target. One of them, a battered fortress of steel and smoke, was hit again and again. Its tail was shredded, its engines burning, and yet, it did not fall. German ace pilots circled in disbelief. How could this massive beast still be flying? They had seen planes vanish in flames with far less damage. But this was something else. The flying fortress seemed alive, defying every law of war and gravity itself. To the Germans, it became a nightmare made of metal. To the Americans, it was a symbol of courage and engineering beyond imagination. This is the story of the aircraft that terrified the Luftwaffe, and refused to die. The year was 1943. Over the war-torn skies of Europe, a new kind of battle was being fought, one of endurance, courage, and sheer willpower. The United States Army Air Forces had unleashed their newest weapon, the Boeing B-17, proudly nicknamed the Flying Fortress. To many, it looked like just another bomber. But to those who faced it, it became something far more terrifying. German pilots, the feared Luftwaffe aces of the sky, quickly learned that shooting down a B-17 was unlike any other mission. You could pour hundreds of bullets into its fuselage, tear holes through its wings, even blow away an engine, and somehow, impossibly, it would still limp home. Each encounter carved its legend deeper into history. The B-17 didn't just drop bombs, it dropped fear into the hearts of enemy pilots. This is the untold story of the American bomber that earned its name, the Flying Fortress. Long before German pilots trembled at the sight of its shadow, the B-17 began as a dream born in the Boeing workshops of Seattle in the early 1930s. The world was changing. War clouds gathered over Europe once again, and the U.S. military needed an aircraft that could fly higher, faster, and farther than anything before it. The answer would become one of the most iconic machines ever built, the Boeing Model 299, later known as the B-17 Flying Fortress. When the prototype first took flight in 1935, reporters watched in awe. Its sleek design, powered by 4 roaring engines, looked unlike any bomber of its time. But it was a journalist from the Seattle Times who gave it the name that would echo through history, the Flying Fortress, after noticing the heavy armor and bristling gun turrets that jutted from its fuselage like the walls of a medieval castle. As the United States entered World War II, the B-17 became the spearhead of America's daylight bombing campaign over Nazi-occupied Europe. While the British preferred the cover of night, the Americans believed in striking under the sun, a bold, dangerous strategy that demanded extraordinary courage and an aircraft tough enough to survive the unrelenting fire of the Luftwaffe. Each B-17 carried 10 men, brothers forged not by blood, but by mission. The pilot, co-pilot, navigator, bombardier, radio operator, and gunners each played a role in keeping their flying fortress alive. The plane was designed not only for attack, but for survival. Its armored plating protected vital systems. Its 12.50 caliber machine guns formed a deadly ring of defense, capable of turning approaching enemy fighters into plumes of smoke. But beyond its engineering, what truly defined the B-17 was its spirit. Crews quickly began to believe that their aircraft had a will of its own, that somehow, the Flying Fortress wanted to bring them home. They told stories of planes returning with half their tails missing, holes large enough to crawl through, and engines shot to pieces, yet landing safely on English runways. As word spread, so did the legend. Among the German Luftwaffe, whispers began, tales of American bombers that refused to die, that kept flying long after logic said they shouldn't. And among the Allies, pride grew. The B-17 wasn't just a machine, it was a symbol of American strength, of unyielding spirit, of defiance in the face of impossible odds. The stage was set. The Flying Fortress was ready to write its name in history, not through perfection, but through survival. By the summer of 1943, the war in the air had turned into a brutal chess match, one played thousands of feet above the earth, where every move meant life or death. The Luftwaffe, once unstoppable, now faced a new enemy that refused to break, the B-17 flying fortress. From their bases in England, waves of B-17s lifted off each morning, their silver wings glinting in the cold sunlight. Engines thundered in perfect unison as they formed tight formations stretching for miles. To the men inside, it felt like flying inside a storm of metal and noise, but to the Germans watching from the ground, it looked like an invading armada blotting out the sky. When radar screens lit up and air raid sirens wailed, squadrons of Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf 190s scrambled into the air. The German pilots had trained to tear apart enemy bombers with precision, but the B-17s were unlike anything they had faced before. Captain Hans Müller, a Luftwaffe ace credited with 20 kills, once described his first encounter with the flying fortress. "We hit one again and again," he said. "I saw fuel streaming from its wings, smoke trailing from both engines. It should have exploded, any other plane would have. But it kept flying. It just wouldn't die." From the cockpit of a German fighter, the sight was maddening. Each attack run was met with a wall of .50 caliber fire from the B-17's guns. Tail gunners, waist gunners, and turret gunners rained lead in every direction. It was like diving into a hurricane of bullets. Even the most experienced pilots found their courage tested as tracer rounds whipped past their canopies. Still, the Germans pressed their attacks. They came in waves, head-on, from below, from the sides, anything to find a weakness. And yet, mission after mission, the bombers kept coming back. In the skies over Schweinfurt and Regensburg, the Luftwaffe unleashed hell. The Americans lost dozens of planes, but what shocked the Germans most were the ones that didn't fall. Damaged beyond belief, burning, shredded, and somehow still flying. One bomber, hit so hard that its tail section was nearly severed, limped all the way back to England. Its crew used their parachute cords to hold the fuselage together and landed safely. When German pilots saw reports of such survivals, disbelief turned to unease. What were these machines made of? Steel? Or sheer will? Soon, the B-17 gained a new kind of power, psychological. German pilots began referring to it with dread. Some said they could feel the fear settle in before even taking off. "You don't fight a flying fortress," one German pilot reportedly said. "You fight death itself." Above the clouds, the war had become something more than bullets and metal. It had become a contest of spirit. Each time a B-17 limped home, it carried with it not just its crew, but a message, that no matter how fierce the storm, courage and faith could outlast fear. And as the bombers kept returning to their English bases, riddled with holes yet still alive, one truth became clear: the Germans had found their match. The sky itself was no longer theirs. As the war raged on, one mission after another turned the skies over Europe into graveyards of burning metal. But amid that chaos, stories began to spread, stories that defied all reason. Stories of flying fortresses that refused to die. Among them was one mission that became legend, a mission that even German pilots remembered with disbelief. It was December 20, 1943, deep over German territory. A B-17 named Ye Old Pub, piloted by 2nd Lieutenant Charlie Brown, had just completed a bombing run over Bremen. The mission had gone horribly wrong. Anti-aircraft shells had torn through the formation, and Brown's B-17 was hit hard. Flak exploded around the aircraft, shredding its nose, puncturing fuel tanks, and killing several crewmen instantly. 2 of its 4 engines were gone. The oxygen system failed, and the tail gunner lay unconscious. The plane should have been finished. But somehow, Brown kept it level. With blood freezing on his face and the controls barely responding, he turned the crippled bomber toward home. Then came the worst sound of all, the rising roar of German engines. A lone Messerschmitt Bf-109 appeared on the horizon, closing fast. Inside that fighter was Franz Stigler, a Luftwaffe ace with 22 victories to his name. He had already shot down one bomber that day. When he saw ye old pub staggering alone, barely 500 feet off the ground, he prepared for an easy kill. But as Stigler approached, what he saw stunned him. The B-17 was riddled with holes, its nose shattered, its tail twisted, one wing half gone. Through the open fuselage he could see crewmen slumped over their guns, their blood frozen by the wind. The rear gunner's position hung open and silent, no one was firing back. Stigler's finger hovered over the trigger, and then, something stopped him. In that moment, he realized he wasn't looking at an enemy. He was looking at men who had already lost the fight but refused to surrender. Their courage struck him like lightning. Instead of finishing them off, he eased up on the throttle and flew alongside the crippled bomber. Brown, dazed and bleeding, couldn't believe what he was seeing, a German fighter escorting him through enemy skies. Stigler motioned for Brown to turn toward neutral Sweden, where the crew could land safely. But Brown refused. He was determined to bring his battered fortress home to England. For several minutes, the two planes flew side by side, enemies bound by an unspoken code of honor. As they neared the coast, Stigler raised his hand in salute. Brown, too weak to respond, simply nodded. The German pilot broke formation, banking away and disappearing into the clouds. Ye old pub somehow made it across the North Sea and crash-landed in England. Against every odd, most of the crew survived. When Brown reported what had happened, his commanders ordered him to keep it secret. No one would believe that a German ace had spared an American bomber. Decades later, after the war, Brown tracked down Stigler, and the two men met again, this time as old men, not enemies. They embraced like brothers, bound forever by that extraordinary day when humanity triumphed over hatred. But for the Luftwaffe, the legend of the flying fortress only grew darker. Each time a B-17 came back from the dead, it chipped away at their confidence. Pilots began to whisper that the Americans had built machines that couldn't be destroyed. Some swore they saw bombers flying home with entire tails missing. Others claimed to have shot one until it exploded, only to see another just like it appear minutes later. What began as frustration soon turned into fear. They weren't just fighting planes anymore. They were fighting symbols, fortresses that carried not only bombs, but the spirit of a nation that refused to fall. In the end, the B-17's greatest weapon wasn't its armor or its guns. It was its defiance. Every mission, every scar, every miraculous return reminded the world that courage could not be shot down. And in that truth lay the heart of the legend, the indestructible fortress that refused to die. To understand why German pilots were so haunted by the flying fortress, you have to look beyond its legend, into the very bones of its design. The B-17 wasn't just built to fight, it was built to survive. Every inch of the aircraft had a purpose. Its designers at Boeing didn't create a bomber, they created a fortress in the sky. Thick armor plating protected the cockpit, engines, and fuel tanks. Even the windows were made from bullet-resistant glass. The fuel tanks were lined with self-sealing rubber that could close up after being punctured by enemy fire, preventing catastrophic explosions. The structure itself was revolutionary. Instead of being a fragile shell like earlier bombers, the B-17's frame used a semi-monocoque design, a combination of lightweight aluminum and internal support ribs that distributed damage evenly. That meant even when entire sections were torn apart, the plane could remain airborne long enough to bring its crew home. Then there was the firepower. With up to 13 heavy .50 caliber machine guns, the flying fortress was a beast. Each crew member manned a gun position, from the chin turret to the waist, from the tail to the top. No angle was safe for an attacker. A single German fighter could face withering crossfire from multiple guns at once. One Luftwaffe pilot described attacking a B-17 formation as flying into a wall of fire. But it wasn't just the individual plane that made the difference, it was the formation. Dozens of B-17s flew in tight, combat boxes, overlapping their fields of fire so that every bomber protected the others. This turned the sky into a deadly fortress wall. Any German fighter that dove in too close risked being shredded by gunfire from multiple directions. Still, toughness came at a cost. The B-17 wasn't fast enough to outrun fighters, nor could it carry as many bombs as the British Lancaster. What it offered instead was reliability, and the faith of its crews. Men trusted the fortress with their lives. They joked that she had a soul, that she looked after her boys. And often, she did. Some fortresses came home with over 600 bullet holes. Others returned missing an engine, or even a section of wing. Yet they landed, time and time again. Ground crews would stare in disbelief, counting the holes, shaking their heads. To the Germans, it seemed supernatural, a machine that defied destruction. But to the Americans, it was proof of engineering genius and the indomitable spirit of those who flew her. The B-17 didn't just earn its nickname, it lived it. And that strength, both mechanical and moral, turned an aircraft into a legend. By the final years of the war, the sky over Europe had changed forever. The once dominant Luftwaffe was now outnumbered, exhausted, and haunted by the unyielding shadow of the flying fortress. What began as a challenge to American courage had become a symbol of German despair. For every fortress that fell, another seemed to rise in its place, roaring engines echoing across the cold clouds, silver wings catching the sun. German pilots began to admit privately what they could never say aloud: they respected the B-17 and the men who flew it. It was no longer just an enemy aircraft, it was an adversary worthy of honor. Franz Stigler, the German ace who spared Charlie Brown's crippled B-17, later said, "To shoot at them was one thing, but to see one survive, that was something else entirely." They had courage. And their plane had a soul. His words captured what thousands of pilots on both sides eventually felt, that in the end, the war in the air wasn't just about machines, but about men. The flying fortress embodied something larger than war. It represented endurance when hope was thin, defiance when death seemed certain, and faith when everything else was falling apart. Its legacy stretched far beyond the smoke and the fire. After the war, many B-17s were scrapped or forgotten. But their stories lived on, told by veterans, written in books, captured in photographs of torn wings and smiling crews standing beside impossible wrecks that somehow came home. The B-17 became a symbol of the greatest generation itself, tough, determined, and unwilling to give up no matter the odds. Even today, when one of the few remaining flying fortresses takes to the air, people look up in silence. The deep rumble of its engines carries echoes of that time, of the fear it inspired, the lives it saved, and the respect it earned. It wasn't just a bomber. It was a promise, that courage, once ignited, can never be shot down. The B-17 flying fortress was more than steel and engines, it was the heartbeat of a generation that refused to surrender. Through fire, flak, and fury, it carried its crews home against all odds. To the Germans, it was a nightmare. To the Americans, a guardian in the sky. Long after the last mission ended, its echo remained, the thunder of engines over Europe, a sound that once meant hope for some and fear for others. The flying fortress didn't just survive the war, it defined it. And its story, like its spirit, will never fall from the sky.